Hello, my name is Ken Ballard Jr. I'm the pastor here at Encounter Community Church. And if you're watching this, that means that you are tuning in to a re-recording of the message that I did on Sunday. I actually attempted to record it on Saturday, but had computer issues, and then we weren't able to do the live stream yesterday. So I still wanted to record the message for those of you that want it. And I've already tested it this morning, and the live stream will be back on Sunday. So thank you so much for your patience and for hanging in there with us. Let me go ahead and pray. Father, I just thank you. I thank you for this time for us to come together. Lord, I just pray that you would lead and guide this time. Father, there wouldn't be a surprise for someone who's watching this that may be going through something right now. And I pray that you would use today to encourage them. I use this moment whenever they're watching this to encourage them, to know that you love them, and that whatever it is that they're walking through life, that you will walk through it with them. And all these things I ask in your name. Amen. So again, right now we are in the middle of doing a series called Certainty in Times of Uncertainty. And for those of you that may not know, what inspired this message, or inspired this series, is a few weeks ago, one of the things that we like to do for our church is I like to put a reading plan together for our church to be able to do together during the week. Whoever wants to jump in can join us for that. And then also there's no judgment with that. So if you jump in and join us and you read one day, praise God that you read that one day. We're just glad that you're doing it with us. But with that in mind, I was looking for a new reading plan, and I saw this title, Certainty in the Times of Uncertainty. And I thought, oh my goodness, that is what people really need right now. Because the overwhelming conversations that I hear, are people talking about fear of the unknown, fear of what's going to happen. And I think that that's been magnified, for example, when we look at the fires that happened here in California. For many of us that live where I live at, we're looking at maybe a 20, 30-minute drive away. And so it really hit home for us because we've driven down the freeway and we've seen those passages, or those areas that are burned. And so because of that, like so many people are wrestling and struggling with fear. And then you look at the world news and everything that's going on with the world news. Last year we were talking about possible World War III, all of those things. There's so much fear. And so I thought, well, what about doing a series that will encourage us to look at how do we navigate difficulties when they happen in our lives, and how can we be confident when everything around us is uncertain? How can we have that confidence? So with that in mind, I hope that this today is encouragement to you. Last week, we looked at this idea of what if, because what if can really challenge our minds. What if can really drive us. And the problem behind what if is it's usually driven by fear. And so what we said last week was the goal of someone who follows Jesus is to move from what if to even if. Because just because I follow Jesus doesn't mean bad things won't happen, that I won't go through difficulties. But what I can do is, even if everything falls apart, God, I'm still going to worship you. I'm still going to adore you. So if you missed that, go back and watch that last week. But to kick off today, have you ever watched the movie Titanic? And I don't know if you remember that one point where the antagonists, they're trying to put people onto the lifeboats. And the call is always for what first, right? What? Women and children. So they're trying to put women and children on this lifeboat, and the antagonist comes over and is demanding to be put on the lifeboat, like demanding it. And when you think about that, like that's kind of crazy. But another example, I don't know if you watch Seinfeld, but there's this one episode where George is at a party, and there's like a clown at the party, that kind of thing. And when he's there, he begins to notice smoke, and fire breaks out. And George yells, "Fire!" and runs out of the room. And as he's running out of the room, he knocks over children, he knocks over women, he knocks over an old lady that's on a walker. Like George is determined to get out of there. And so the next cut scene is George sitting on an ambulance, and people around the party are talking to him along with the firemen. And so they say to George, why did you knock over women and children to get out of there? And George was saying, a leader. We needed a leader. And they said, well, why didn't you stop at the door to help lead people out of the room? And he says, well, somebody had to check to make sure that the hallways were clear of fire. So I was just doing my job as a leader. Well, why didn't you come back to help people? Well, I just wanted to make sure that everybody got out, so the best way for me to do that is do it for us. I mean, it's just crazy, excuse after excuse after excuse. And the firefighter looks at him and says, how do you live with yourself? And George responds, it's really hard. Like, it's really difficult. Now, I bring up that example to say this. A crisis always reveals your makeup. A crisis always reveals your makeup. So the idea behind that is what really is in you is revealed in times of crisis. What really is in you is revealed in times of crisis. So if you are compassionate, caring, loving, unselfish, that will be revealed, and it will show itself in times of crisis. However, if you're the flip side of that, where you're selfish, and it's all about self-preservation, then that will also show up in times of a crisis as well. Now, why do I say that? It's because here's our goal. Like, if we are someone who's made a commitment to follow Jesus, then here is what it should look like, and that is people shine when they are the best version of themselves when it matters most. People shine when they are the best version of themselves when it matters most. And so that's the goal of this series. And that's the goal of today. It is, how do I become the best version of myself so when difficulties happen, that my life shines, that my life is an example, that people will look at my life and say, man, if that's what faith looks like, that's what I desire to have happen in my life. I want that kind of faith. I want your kind of God. I want to be like you when impossibilities happens, where your faith is just exemplary and it really stands out. So now here's the motivation behind the message today. I'm in a New Testament class, and in my New Testament class, I'm in the process of writing a paper, and please pray for me, because the workload of this New Testament class is kicking my tail. So please pray for me. But I have to write a paper, and so basically, what we have to do is we have to pick a passage that is found in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Like, all three of those Gospels cover this passage. And so I started looking, and I found this passage. I started digging into it. I started doing research on it, and I found a very interesting correlation between the passage that I chose and the passage that I'm going to be talking about today. And there's also another passage that the similarities are just really striking. The experiences are really striking. They're just so similar. And the interesting thing about that is, in one situation, we have the lead character, which is Jesus Christ. And we're going to see how Jesus responds in crisis. And then in another situation that's very similar, we have a guy named Jonah. And you might be familiar with Jonah. You know the story. Jonah falls into the sea, is swallowed by the great whale. People say, well, the Bible says fish is probably more likely a big fish. I don't know what kind of fish it was, but there's no whale in the Sea of Galilee. There's no whales there. So it had to be a really large fish. But with that in mind, many of us are familiar with Jonah and that story. And so Jonah is in this boat, and there is a response that he has to this situation. And so as we look at both situations, there may be some things that we can learn about ourselves as well. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. In Mark chapter 4, verse 37, it says, "But soon a fierce storm came up. High waves were breaking into the boat, and it began to fill with water." And in Jonah's situation, that was Jesus. In Jonah's situation, it says, "But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart." So that's where these stories are so similar, is you have the disciples and Jesus in one boat, you have sailors and Jonah in another boat, and in both situations, the boat is a rocking. It's a rocking. And I don't know why I did that for boat that's rocking. but I'll probably do it again. but the boat is rocking. And so it is crazy. And so it is rocking so much that as a result of it, the people on the boat are freaking out. They're freaking out. Except for Jesus and Jonah. And what we're going to see is they have very different and categorical reasons for the responses that they have. So let's go with Jesus first. It says, Jesus was, go ahead and say that. Jesus was sleeping, that's right, at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown?" And I don't think they meant just themselves. Like, they're freaking out like, "Jesus, you on the boat with us. If we go down, Jesus, you go down." Like we are freaking out. Shouldn't you be freaking out too? We're running around the boat. Shouldn't you be running around the boat too? So they're going through this situation. But Jesus is the complete opposite, where Jesus is sleeping and resting. And I think there's a reason why. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But before we get there, looking at Jonah chapter 1, verse 5, it says, "Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was" what? "Sound asleep down in the hold." Jonah was sound asleep. So again, here we are. We're going to drown. People are freaking out, throw stuff overboard, like, oh, we're going to die. We are going to die. And Jonah is sleeping. And not just sleeping, it says he was sound asleep. So what is the difference between Jesus and Jonah in this situation? And what can we learn so that we can be able to take it and implement it into our lives? And I will say this. When we look at Jesus, we look at the sleep of someone who is in his purpose. There is no greater sleep that you can have in your life than the sleep of purpose. That during this day, I came, I did what I was designed to do, I lived the way that I was designed to live, I accomplished that which I was designed to accomplish. I lived out my purpose today. I lived out my purpose. Well, what is the purpose of Jesus? He says it this way in Luke chapter 4, verses 18 and 19. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim that captives will be released, that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come." And at the time of the Lord's favor has come. So that's what Jesus is saying. That's my purpose, to free the oppressed, to bring hope to the poor, to help those who are in need. And ultimately, we know that this purpose moves Jesus so much that eventually he goes to the cross on our behalf and dies for us and rises again so that we can too be free, so that we too can be whole, so that we too can be renewed. He does that for us. And so in a minute, I want to talk about our purpose. Because if Jesus is living the life of purpose and sleeping the sleep of purpose, even when everything around him is in turmoils and is a mess, then how do we get to that place where we can live the life of purpose and have the sleep of purpose even when everything around us is going bonkers? But now let's flip the script. And let's talk about Jonah. Because here's what happened with Jonah, is God goes to Jonah and he says, look, here's what I want you to do, is I want you to go to this town called Nineveh. The people that are there have lived some horrible lives. Matter of fact, Nineveh was the capital of an area called Assyria. And Assyria was known for atrocities that they would do to the people that they conquered. I mean, just horrific things that they would do. And so basically what God was saying is, look, if you don't turn from these horrific things that you're doing, there's going to be a cost. There's going to be a consequence. And by sending Jonah, what God is saying is, look, I want to rescue you from that. I don't want you to go through that cost. I don't want you to go through that loss. I don't want you to go through that consequence. So Jonah, I want you to go to them and give them a message so they can have a message of hope. Hopefully they turn their lives around and they're able to save themselves and save their city. And Jonah, now realize, Assyria and Israel were mortal enemies. Mortal enemies. So when God says to Jonah, hey, I want you to go to the capital city of your mortal enemies and give them a message of hope, Jonah's like, no, I don't think so. I'm not going to do that. Why? Because when Jonah hears that there's a possibility that his enemy can be destroyed, then the last thing that Jonah wants to do is bring them a message of hope so that they turn their lives around so that they don't have to be destroyed. So Jonah's like, you made your boat, you made your bed, you're gonna have to lie in it. You have to lie in it. So I'm not going. And as a matter of fact, what Jonah does is Jonah goes in a completely different direction. It says in Jonah chapter 1, verse 3, but Jonah got up and went in the opposite direction to get away from the Lord. So God wanted him to go to Nineveh here. He's like, no, I'm going to go to a city called Tarshish here. He went down to the port of Joppa where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and went on board, hoping to escape from the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. That's interesting. When I say that, right, it sounds like I have a lisp or something, doesn't it? But Tarshish. So he goes in the opposite direction. Like, no, I'm not. I am not going where you want me to go. And if anything, what Jonah does is he steps out of God's purpose. And my daughter says something really brilliant as we were talking about this message after she heard it on Sunday, or yesterday, or on Sunday. She said something really brilliant. She said, Dad, is it possible that what Jonah did was sleeping really well because Jonah was living out his own purpose, which was not to do the purpose of God? And I thought, see, that's why you're the pastor, the daughter of a pastor. You're just freaking brilliant, because I didn't even think about that. But it's true. He's sleeping the sleep of sound sleepness because he's living his purpose too. And his purpose is to see Nineveh destroyed. And so another reason why Jonah doesn't wake up is because if this boat sinks, he dies. And if he dies, they definitely don't hear the message. So let me die in this boat. Let me die on this ship. That's what Jonah most likely is thinking. So going back to us and looking at us, because we said again, right? We said people shine when they are the best version of themselves in times of crisis or when it matters most. So then how can we be the best version of ourselves when it matters most? And that is when we make a commitment that I am going to live a life of purpose. That is the beauty of living a life that matters most, that shines. And so what is our purpose? It says in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, so this is Jesus speaking to the disciples just before he ascends and goes back to heaven. So he says this to them. He says, look, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses, telling people about me everywhere in Jerusalem, throughout Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. That's what Jesus says. You'll be my witnesses. So if we've decided to say, Jesus, I will follow you, then one of the purposes of my life and the reason why I am still on this earth is so that I can fulfill the purpose of being an eyewitness, of telling people about the goodness of God, of telling people about the way that God worked in my life, of telling people about hope, of telling people about his love, of telling people about his peace, of telling people about his confidence, of telling people about what God brings into my life, and hopefully it gives them the opportunity to be able to have it in their lives as well. And so if there are ways that we can get involved, maybe at work, maybe conversations we can have at work, maybe conversations we can have on the practice field, maybe conversations we can have at school, maybe conversations we can have when we're during our hobbies, or just whatever it may be, that our lives are here for the purpose of communicating the good news of Jesus Christ to others so that hopefully they take that step in being able to come to know him. So, how can we shine when it matters most? How can we be the best version of ourselves when it matters most? Live a life of purpose, no matter our circumstances. Live a life of purpose, no matter our circumstances. And then, what I wanted to do is I wanted to go on and look at not only just Jesus and the disciples, but Jesus and Jonah. I want to look at the disciples, and I also want to look at the people with Jonah. And I want to see if you see what I see, which is pretty straightforward. It says in Mark chapter 4, verse 38, it says, in Mark chapter 4, I clicked the wrong one. In Mark chapter 4, verse 38, it says, Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples, so that's who we're looking at now, the disciples woke him up shouting, "Teacher, don't you care that we are going to drown?" And then this is the one for Jonah chapter 1, verse 5. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was sound asleep in the hold. Jonah was sound asleep in the hold. So here's the question. In both the disciples as well as the sailors, and it doesn't just say sailors, it says that they were what? Desperate sailors. Now here's the thing. If they're sailors, they're used to being on water, right? They're used to being on water. So for there to be a storm that freaks them out so much that these sailors move to a point of desperation because of it, that has to tell you how bad this storm is. And now, if we move to the disciples, if we look at the disciples, it also says that the disciples were also freaking out. Now, here's the thing to think about. A quarter, so 4 out of the 12 disciples were fishermen, which meant they were used to being on water. They actually fished the Sea of Galilee. So most likely they were out when storms would hit the Sea of Galilee. So for this storm to be so bad that they are freaking out as well, because it doesn't say all of the disciples except for 4. Those 4 had it together. Those 4 were calm. Those 4 were trusting Jesus. It doesn't say that at all. Nor does it say these 4 were like, "Hey, brothers, it'll be all right. Just trust Jesus. And if Jesus is sleeping, then he's okay, then we're going to be okay too." Is that what they did? No. They're freaking out along with the others that are freaking out. And here's what I believe. It says, fearing for their lives, going back to the guys with Jonah, it says that they called out to their gods, and they begin to throw things overboard because what they're hoping is as they lighten the ship, that the ship will stay above the water and stay above the waves so that they would be able to survive. So in other words, they're doing everything humanly possible to save themselves. And I don't doubt that what the disciples are probably doing is probably rowing. Hey, row. Hey, Peter, why don't you bail? Actually, Peter, you're a fisherman. You row. Judas, you bail. Like they're probably having people bail water because they were freaking out at this point. But here's what they were doing, is they were doing everything humanly possible to save themselves. But then what happens is the disciples have a brilliant moment, and they turn to Jesus And they wake Jesus up, and they say, Jesus, don't you care? And then here's what happens with the sailors that were on the boat with Jonah. It says in Jonah chapter 1, verse 6, so the captain went down after him, and it's him being Jonah. How can you sleep at a time like this? He shouted. Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives. Now, a quick commentary on Jonah is, think about this. Not only does Jonah really not care about dying, he's sleeping so well because he also doesn't care about the sailors who are with him, that they might die as well. It's not like Jonah gets up and says, Father God, I pray that you protect the lives of these sailors, but throw me overboard. He doesn't say anything like that at all. If he dies and they die, he's fine. So they come up with the solution. Hey, we've tried our gods. You have a different God. So why don't you pray to your God and see if your God will spare our lives as well? Now, what can we learn from this? Is I think many of us are like the disciples and the desperate sailors. That what we try to do is we try everything to fix the situation ourselves, and then when it doesn't work, we turn to God. So that brings us to this question. Is God my first option or my last resort? Is God my first option or my last resort? That's the challenge that we have to understand and process and work through in our own lives. Is God my first option? Because here's the thing. If I'm going to be the best version of myself when it matters most and my life shines as a result of it, then I have to be the kind of person where God is my first option. He's my first option. That I go to him, talk about what it is that I go through. Now, I also want to make this really clear. God being our first option does not mean that we still throw cargo overboard, that we do not take measures to try to save ourselves. It does not mean that. We do those things as well. So maybe God being your first option might be you go to him and pray to him while you're still going out and applying for jobs. You go to him and you pray to him while you're still going to get marriage counseling. You go to him and you pray to him while you still go to 12 steps to work through your addiction or whatever it might be. So we go to God in our desperation. God, you are my first option. You are my first option. And here's the beauty of that. When God is my first option, I also tend to look at my circumstances a little bit differently. Although my circumstances may not change, I know that God is with me. Although my circumstances may not change, I know that I have to trust his timing. And I have to depend on him and allow him to be the one who directs the things that need to be directed in my life for it to work out. And most importantly, if God is my first option and it all fails, because there's a possibility that it will. There's a possibility that the crisis in our life cannot be averted. And I know that even in the midst of that, he's going to be there to walk with me through it and guide me through it. And so that I'm able to process it, instead of being in a place of desperation, I'm at a place of faith. And my faith really begins to shine. And it speaks to others about him, about his goodness, about his calling, about his mercy, about the way that he does not give up on us. So if we are going to be the best version of ourselves and shine when it matters most, then we must make a commitment that God, you are my first option and not my last resort. So going on, in Mark chapter 4, verse 39, it says something really interesting. It says, when Jesus woke up, he rebuked the wind and said to the waves, silence, be still. That's my Jesus voice. Silence, be still. Or maybe it's more like, silence, be still. I don't think it's, silence, be still. Sorry, I digress. But I just don't think that's Jesus. It could be. But then it says, suddenly the wind stopped and there was a great calm. I don't know about you, but as I was processing this and looking at this passage, there was a question that came to my mind. why did he rebuke the wind but speak to the waves? Say it again. Why did he rebuke the wind but speak to the waves? So he handled the two causes, or he handled the two aspects of the storm very differently. Very differently. One he rebukes, the other he speaks to. Now, you may not be familiar with the word rebuke because we don't use that a lot in our vernacular. So what does it mean to rebuke? Whenever I prepare messages, I always like to dig into, the Greek if I can find it and what does it mean. And there's this lexicon that I use called the Strong's Lexicon. And it said this about rebuke, and I thought this was really interesting, and so I wanted to share it with you. It says, it often implies a sense of authority and urgency, where the speaker seeks to correct or restrain behavior or speech. And that's from Strong's Lexicon. That's what I used. So, authority and urgency. Authority and urgency. Parents, there are times where we use our authority and speak in urgency, right? When you see your child running towards the street and you yell, stop! You are using your authority and hoping that your child will listen to you. And although they might not see the urgency, you're speaking in urgency because if they don't stop, it could cost them their lives. Authority and urgency. So that's what Jesus does in this moment. Now here's the thing. Why do that to the wind and not the sea? Why rebuke the wind and speak to the sea or speak to the waves? Here's the reason why. Is when Jesus rebukes the waves, see what happens is, or the wind, sorry. What happens is back on the Sea of Galilee, it was in a valley. So there would be wind that would swoop into the valley, and then once it hit the valley, it would cause these squalls or these storms to come up, and it would be crazy, crazy, crazy storms. And so what Jesus does is by speaking to the wind, he is speaking to the cause of the storm. By speaking to the wind, he's speaking to the cause, or rebuking the wind with urgency, right? With authority. He's rebuking the cause of the storm. And then, once the cause is done, once the wind stops, then he speaks to the sea. Because that's the effect. The wind is the cause, but the waves are the effect. And so that's why he speaks to the waves, be still. Be still. He rebukes the wind, silence, speaks to the waves, be still. This is another reason why it's so important for us to trust in Jesus. Because Jesus has the power to do that we can't do. See, when we deal with crisis in our lives, the only thing that we could deal with is the effect. We could do nothing about the cause. Nothing about the cause. Only God has the power to adjust, change, or conquer the cause. So that's why we need to trust in him and depend upon him when crises hit in our lives and begin to really depend on him. But I love what Jesus does there. And so again, if we are going to be the best version of ourselves when it matters most, then it's vital that we begin to trust God in those moments of crisis and say, God, you handle the cause while I navigate the effects. You handle the cause while I navigate the effects. So when Jonah comes up, now I'm switching to Jonah. When Jonah comes up on the boat and Jonah begins to, now he's remember I told you I was going to do it again. Well, when Jonah's on the boat and he's rocking, they're rocking, he's rocking, and so he says to the sailors, hey, I'm the cause of this. So here's what I want you to do, is throw me overboard and it will stop. Just throw me overboard and it'll stop. And the sailors are like, no, we're not going to do that. That's crazy. Why? Because they know what? That if they were to do it, that's murder. That's murder. And so they're like, we're not going to save ourselves by killing you. And so what they decide to do is they keep Jonah on the boat. They fight. The storm gets worse and worse and worse. They fight. So finally, they get to a point, and they're like, all right, bro, come here. You grab his arms. And it's, all right. boy, I don't really want to do this, but you suggested this, and I really have no choice. And they tossed Jonah into the water. And then look what it says in chapter 1, verses 15 and 16. Chapter 1, verse 15 says, "Then the sailors picked up Jonah and threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once." The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice and vowed to serve him. They came to the realization that Jonah spoke truth, and his God was the God. And so we are going to trust in that God. We're going to turn our lives over to him because we have seen a power that is beyond compare. So the sailors and the disciples experienced the same thing. God's power beyond compare. And see, this is why also we need to be committed to trusting him. Because here's the thing, is as we plug away, as we trust in him, we never know how God's power might show up, even in the midst of if the crisis means that we lose everything. There still may be ways that maybe we'll go back and we'll think about it later, and we'll begin to realize, oh, that was God showing up. Oh, that was God showing up. Oh, that was God showing up. When that person donated the money that I needed, that was God showing up. When that job suddenly opened, that was God showing up. So you can begin to look at the different ways that God shows up in powerful, powerful ways. And so why can I be the best version of myself when it matters most is because I just have to firmly believe that God at some point you'll show up. And even if that show up means you strengthen me, encourage me, build me, lift me, then God, I will still trust and rely and depend upon you. Now here's the thing as well, is Jonah is thrown into the water, right? That's what happened with Jonah at this point. And look at what God does. In Jonah chapter 1, verse 17, it says, "Now the Lord had arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah." Jonah's thinking, I'm going to die. I'm going to die. Nineveh's not going to hear about Jesus. I know that's a terrible song, and my pitch is horrible. That's why TJ leads worship and I don't. But here's the thing, is Jonah thinks he's going to, and all of a sudden, boom, a fish comes along. And it says that Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, here's the thing. Again, what kind of fish was it? I don't know. How was Jonah able to live in it for 3 days and 3 nights? I don't know. I do know that becomes symbolic of Jesus, who is also in the future. Another way that Jonah is like Jesus is that Jonah is in the whale. Or Jesus is in the grave for 3 days and I'll get it right. Eventually I'll say what I'm trying to say. But Jesus is in the grave for 3 days and 3 nights, as Jonah was in the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. And then the fish spews Jonah. Now let me tell you this. The fish is not where Jonah wanted to be. It probably smelled inside. It was probably slimy inside. And the fish is still swimming, so he's still probably bouncing around inside. This is the last place that Jonah wanted to be, the absolute last place. But here's the thing. If Jonah is not in the fish, what happens? He drowns. If Jonah is not in the fish, he drowns. And so here's my challenge with us, is sometimes God's solution, the way that God rescues us, and steps into us and steps us and puts us in a position of renewal, sometimes it may result in us being where we don't want to be. And all of a sudden, all we do is we look at where we don't want to be, and it sucks, and it's horrible, and it stinks, and it's slimy, and it's grimy, and I stink. I smell like fish. But here's the deal. If Jonah's not in the fish, he drowns. And so maybe God has you in your hard situation. Because if he didn't, you drown. Maybe your hard situation is your life preserver. Maybe your hard situation is protecting you from something worse. Maybe your hard situation is protecting you from a cost that you can't pay. So in order to be the best version of myself when it matters most, and so that my life shines, then maybe I get to a point where I start to believe that God, even in the middle of this mess, I'm still here because this is the best place for my protection. It may not feel like it. It may not smell like it. You may not think it that way. But maybe what God is doing is protecting you from something that is far worse. So then it says this. The disciples were absolutely terrified. Who is this man? They asked each other. That even the wind and waves obey him. So here's the point. The disciples were able to experience something different about Jesus because they went through the storm. One of the things I found about my own life is I have grown so much more in the storms of my life than I have in the good times of my life. I've learned more about God. I've learned more about myself. I've grown, I've improved myself because of what I've learned from my storm. And so let me tell you this, people are the best version of themselves when they decide to learn from their storm. Don't waste the opportunity of what the storm can teach you and how you will be able to see yourself and God differently. That's the power of the storm. And that's why people shine when they are the best version of themselves when it matters most. Now, here at Encounter, one of the things we want to encourage people to do is to love up. So in other words, I'm falling in love with God, love out. Let me love others the way that God loves me, and love in. As I grow in peace, purpose, and freedom in my life, I find more that I love about myself as well. And so as a result of that, what we do is every message that we share here at Encounter, we end with looking at those three things. And so what we want to give you the freedom to do is you could take one, two, or all and apply them to your life. And so with Love Up, again, make God your first option, not your last resort. Make God your first option, not your last resort, in loving God with all that you have. And Love Out, commit to living out God's given purpose. Because here's the thing, is this world really is in need of hope. I mean, it really is. This world is in need of hope. This world is in need of peace. This world is in need of love. And so it behooves us as believers to go out and be able to be that voice of love that this world really needs, this heart of love, this heart of compassion, this heart of mercy that this world really needs. And then finally, love in. Learn the lesson of the storm. Don't waste the opportunity of what the storm is trying to teach you in your life. Don't waste the opportunity of what the storm is trying to teach you in your life. God, I thank you. I thank you for your compassion and your mercy. God, I thank you that you constantly draw us to you. And God, that ultimately you do not give up on us, that you draw us to come to know you and serve you and live our lives for you. And so, God, I just want to take this time again to pray if there's anyone who's in the midst of a storm right now, I pray that this message speaks to them. Because here's the reality. Either we are in a storm, or we're about to go into a storm, or we just come out of a storm. And so, Lord, I just pray that you would use the storms in our life to draw us, to build us, to strengthen our resolve, and that we will learn the lessons from you that we can learn in the storms that we deal with. God, I thank you for your grace and your mercy. And all these things asking in your name. Amen. I would love the opportunity to pray for you. So if there's anything that I can be praying for, then what you can do is you can utilize that QR code. It takes you to, we have Connect cards, or a Connect page on our website. You can fill it out. If you want to fill out the information for us, know who you are, great. If you just want to do a prayer request, do that. We'll see that, and we would love the opportunity to be able to pray for you. And I do want to encourage you, next week, I'm going to talk about a solution that is vital if we're going to face the storms in our life. And so I want to encourage you, make sure you come back next week as we continue to talk about the idea of being certain in the times of uncertainty. So again, I'm so thankful that you've taken this time to hang out with me. And I really do hope that this has been an encouragement to you. So with that in mind, I just want to say thank you